Welcome. I'm author Jason Lee Willis, and you're about to listen to my personal audio recording of the novel, The Wintermaker. I'm recording this for 3 reasons. First, it's my final stage of the editing process. I've already had professional editors make several passes through the manuscript, but by reading each and every word, it allows me a final check. The second reading for recording this is that many people prefer to listen to stories rather than read the words. Well, storytelling began around a campfire, and this is a story worthy of campfires. My final reason for recording is to expand my YouTube channel, so subscribe and like if you want more content like this. So let's begin. Prelude, The Wintermaker, Nob Hill Campground, Wadena County, Minnesota, June 2029. The dead girl waited patiently for a bus that wasn't coming. Even in the darkness of her tent, Robin Berg could still see her standing atop the hill. It didn't matter if the ghost was a dream or some hallucination or even real. Robin needed to confront it. She needed answers. Her hands searched for items of comfort, passing over her pepper spray and flashlight before finding her open backpack. Inside, she found her dream journal and a pen. Here goes nothing. As soon as Robin stepped outside the tent, she feared she'd messed up. Reality swallowed up the lucid moment, bringing a dying fire, snoring Rottweilers, and a picnic table covered in half-empty beer bottles. Across the Crow Wing River, slivers of light came from the covered windows and doors of the old camper where her stepfather cooked meth with his buddies. 4 kayaks on the eastern shore meant Robin was all alone with the dogs on the opposite shore of the river. Robin squeezed her eyes tight and turned to the hill. "Please stay there." Robin kept her eyes on her bare toes as she walked from the campsite to the stairs that led to the upper level of the campground. The staircase terrified her in either daylight or nighttime, since they reminded her of the scene in The Exorcism where the demon-possessed Father Karras threw himself in his fight with Captain Howdy. Her hand held the red wooden railing for each of the 39 steps, and even at the top, she refused to look up. Having walked the stairs dozens of times in the past few weeks, she knew it was another 15 yards before she reached the parking lot where her father's truck was kept. But instead of using her eyes, she followed her mental image that included Old Copper Road, Bleeding Rock, the Forsberg Farm, the McPherson Farm, and the Guerin Farm. The accident must have happened just past the Guerin house, Robin decided, comparing what she knew to the vision of the dead girl that had woken her a few minutes ago. Robin sat down on the pine straw. It was a cool night, which is why she dressed in sweatpants and a Brainerd Warriors hoodie. When she opened her eyes, the dead girl stood 5 feet in front of her. At least she's not holding a red balloon. Robin mocked her own fears. "What's your name, sweetie?" "Danica Knutson." Danica appeared to be a first or second grader, and aside from a lack of a balloon, she looked like a female version of the kid from It, dressed in a raincoat, galoshes, and a backpack. She wasn't maimed or rotting, just cold and wet. She sees me. Do I look real to her, or am I the apparition? Even the eyes of a dead 8-year-old brought judgment, but Danica didn't say anything cruel. "Do you know when the bus is coming?" "Don't confuse her or she'll slip away." "Honey, I don't even know what year it is." Danica giggled. "It's 1962. "What time does the bus usually pick you up?" when the bell rings, but what's wrong? There are no bells because... Why are there no bells today? Because of the storm and the flood. Damn, this is what they wanted me to learn. Lily and the others tried to explain the disaster that happened. But from the way they told it, it was supposed to happen decades into the future, not a century earlier. Is this why everything is wrong for me? Robin found the pen sticking out of the spine of the notebook she held. I love getting out of school early. Danica responded, still unaware she'd been dead for more than 60 years. I'm supposed to take the bus to my grandparents' house, but I don't know where my sister went. Oh, honey, you're dead, trapped in the waters of Lake Manitou. Robin's heart pounded in her chest, not from her ghostly encounter. That was her norm, but because Lily had been right. Robin looked up to the stars, but the constellation of Orion was nowhere to be seen during the summer. The Wintermaker, our mortal enemy. She did find the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, and the bright North Star reminded her of the grim tales told to her under the willow. How can I be the one who saves the world? I'm a freak, a weirdo that everybody hates. I'm hallucinating about a dead girl that's probably just a figment of my imagination. For all I know, my stepdad slipped something in my burger and I'm just tripping. Did they make an announcement? My teacher didn't say anything to us, Robin pressed. Danica nodded. The storm's going to make it flood really bad. How big of a flood are we talking? Can I wait here with you? Danica nodded. I'm just going to work on my homework while we wait, Robin explained why she opened up her dream journal. She quickly added a new page for Danica Knutson and jotted down all the incidental details that she'd learned, finishing with a few questions that would guide the remaining minutes of her conversation. Storm? Flood? What's special about 1962? How did Danica Knutson die? Robin looked around Nob Hill Campground and overlaid the image of Old Copper Road. She jotted down a final question. What the hell happened to Lake Manitou? Chapter 1. The Roots of Layrod. Mount Hermon, Israel. April 30th, 1961. The sweet smell of tobacco smoke surrounded the Lincoln Continental, where it was parked away from the tour buses and the passenger vehicles. What the hell is taking so long? Behind the Lincoln, the last of the crowds emerged from the ancient ruins of Caesarea Philippi, found at the base of the towering Mount Hermon. Just past the parking lot, in a crease at the base of the mountain, the legendary Cave of Pan lurked. Its magical spring not only formed the headwaters of Lake Galilee and the Jordan River, but it was rumored to be the gates of hell. Stupid tourists. Red Dobie looked toward the woods in front of the Lincoln. Although nothing prohibited anyone from entering the dense area surrounding the cold stream, he still kept watch while the others scouted the location. Chirani Basant, dressed in a white suit, came out of the thicket holding a stack of books to his chest. He looked toward the Cave of Pan, the emptying parking lot, and at the Lincoln before continuing back. What kind of man wears a white suit? The two men were genetic opposites. Red was pale, red-haired, squatty, and middle-aged. Basant was mahogany, black-haired, lean, and fresh out of Yale. Is everything secure? If I'd had my way, you wouldn't be here, Red thought. We're at a public ancient wonder of the world. Of course we're not secure. He took a long drag from his cigar. Everyone's been paid to keep the place shut up for the night. Did you find what you were looking for? The Nepalese scholar nodded. We're going to perform the ritual this evening, for here in Israel, a new day begins at dusk. Are you ready? I was born ready for this. Red felt the weight of his pistols strapped inside of his jacket and the cool of the metal hilt tucked against his calf. I'm ready for anything. Lead on. He took a few last puffs from his cigar and tossed the rest onto the parking lot. 100 yards from the parking lot, the geography of Israel transformed from rocky mountains to a dense, humid wood. Red's toes knew where to go, toward water. His father had been foreman at the Nicollet Dam in rural Hiawatha County, Minnesota. But this river sounded much different than the Blue Knife. Near the bubbling brook, he saw two figures standing in front of a massive willow tree. The aging gentleman he knew well, Alistair Sinclair. She says there is powerful magic lingering in the air and that waiting another night would be a mistake, Sinclair confirmed. The old witch has him under her spell. Standing beside the 60-year-old Sinclair was Amu Hutananen, the 20-something religious scholar and seductress who'd found her way onto the arm of one of the world's most powerful men. She didn't even glance at Red, instead focusing her attention on Basant. Thank you for finding this place, she said. I could have searched my whole life and never found it. Basant beamed. The old legends speak of 3 places upon the earth where the roots connect. Here in the middle of the world of men, far to the east in the land of giants, and in the roaring kettle known as Lake Manitou, where our friend Red comes from. Now the witch, draped in a red shawl, studied him closely. Come, we must go under the willow. Red followed, passing through the willow fronds like an emerald curtain. Under the tree, it was already night. The 4 stood for a moment until Alistair Sinclair sat down. First, let's find out what happened. Are you ready? Amu's eyes were already focused on the branches of the tree, a wry smile on her face. Do you mind if I take notes on the ritual? Chirani Basant asked. For my study. Amu did not break her gaze. If my Jarl allows it. Her Jarl? Red tried to hide his reaction to her use of the old Norse word for king. Sinclair nodded, and Basant joined him on the ground. Without even looking, the young witch reached out her hand for Red's hand. When he stepped back, she frowned. I will need your help to begin. It's just a ritual. Red found his switchblade, and with a flick of his thumb, the silver steel glistened in the low light. She turned to Sinclair. Let your blood be an introduction, my Jarl. The roots will remember. Thumb or palm, sir? Sinclair presented his thumb. Red steadied the old man's hand and quickly rolled the blade across the thumb. In an instant, Amu's cupped hands collected the drops. She then turned to Red. The roots will remember your blood as well. Holding the switchblade in his right, he quickly flicked an open incision onto his left thumb, letting the blood join in Amu's cupped hand. With the accumulated blood, she began to wring her hands as if washing under a sink, creating sleeves of crimson. She collected a low-reaching frond and walked it back like a tether as she sat at the base of the tree. It's so beautiful, she said, her eyes closed. I can see beyond. We need you to use your gifts to help us, Sinclair said. Look past this place. Look to the west. A slight gasp came from her mouth. I can see the other route. I can hear the roaring waters. I can hear Nidhogg sleeping in the depths. We're not alone. What is it? Sinclair asked. I see others in the present. The third root has 3 roots. I see an old man on a metal folding chair, waiting. I see a woman leaning against a trunk, writing down what she sees in her branches. And there is an old woman of native blood, gathering the branches. I know her, Red thought. My father told me about her. Lily Guerin. Amu's smile vanished, and she opened her eyes to look at Sinclair. I can see the present, but there's only one way to travel up the branches or into the roots. You're doing this on your own accord, Sinclair began. No one is pressuring you to do it. I'm willing to pay the price, she said, extending her free arm to Red. Are you certain? Red asked aloud. When I leave my body, my spirit will spend eternity wandering within Leyrod. Where will your spirit dwell? I guess she's thought about this. Red took hold of her slender forearm, and with a quick pass from his blade, cut open the vein ascending from her thumb. May your journey be swift. Alarm filled her eyes as her mortality pulsed in the air, but she quickly pulled her hand free, placing it on the trunk of the tree, letting the bark catch the blood. Deep in the roots, I can see the past. High in the branches, I can see the future. Look ahead. Tell me what you see in the future, Sinclair instructed. I see other faces connected to Leyrod. Describe them to us, Sinclair commanded. I think I'm seeing the past, present, and future simultaneously. It's all a bit much, she explained. For a moment, her eyes filled with doubt as she glanced down at the blood draining from her body. Then she closed her eyes. I see someone waiting in the future. A woman. Describe her to me, Sinclair said. Amu gasped. It's the goddess Hela. She's real. And she's waiting at the end of the world to bring death to all. How do you know it's Hela herself? It's just as she's described in the tales. Half of her face is alive, and the other half is the face of death. Don't worry. Trani Basant reached forward to touch the dying witch. We will prevent this future from coming true. Tell us what you see deep in the roots. Tell us about the past. With her life fading, Amu told a familiar tale about a young woman who accidentally woke a sleeping god, who, along with Hel, would bring about the destruction of the world. The Finnish witch, however, stayed strong until the end, and with the frenzied pen of Basant writing descriptions, she described generations of faces who also stood under the willow. I see him. For a moment, Red thought the witch had uttered her last words, but she found strength for another breath. I see him at the beginning as well as at the end. They trick him. They What do you see, Amu? Sinclair leaned forward. The Wintermaker. Before the world can end, Sinclair spoke softly, the triple winter, known as Fimbulvettermus, will arrive. The future she sees can be changed, Chirani Basant whispered softly. We can't let them bring destruction to the world. But there is another way. Focus on the past, Sinclair pressed. Seek a moment of vulnerability. Reach back. Let your life save the lives of many. Amu grew silent for several moments. Sinclair is willing to let her die to get his answers, Red observed. Perhaps he is indeed the descendant of the earliest Vikings. The witch took a deep breath. The roots are weakest around the moment the Wintermaker was woken by the young witch. She unleashed raw magic into the world without any control. If we... Her breathing grew labored. They create a bridge, a loop that connects the present to the past. If we attack them in the present, we can use this bridge to destroy what they've done. But it will require more than one death. Tell me about the Nexus, Sinclair said. Secrets from the past came forth until her last breath. When her fingers released the willow frond and her other arm slipped from the bark, Red turned away. I'm glad I'm not the one who has to sort this all out. All I need to know is who to kill back at Lake Manitou. Chapter 2, Snap, Crackle, Pop. Split Rock High School, June 1st, 1961. Brian Biff Forsberg plotted his revenge. While his right hand held the pencil, scribbling out words he didn't mean, his left hand found the fourth and final screw under the desk's surface. His thumbnail, toughened by life on a dairy farm, caught the screw head groove, and with the pressure of his index finger, the screw began to turn. He looked up, first at Mr. Cottingham, and then at the clock. The sooner you're done with it, the sooner we can both start our summer break, Brian. Instead of giving a cold glare like he wanted, Biff looked down at his essay, adding more graphite to the lined paper. Below the desk, the screw wobbled and fell into his palm. His writing pace doubled. And now to collect the others. One by one, the other loose screws fell into his palm. He added a period and carefully stood up. I'm finished. Are you? Doesn't he think I can write, asshole? Well, then bring it here. Cottingham didn't budge from his throne, and Biff presented himself a repentant subject. Outside the window, the buses from the field trip had already unloaded, and children flowed in all directions. You're going to be in 7th grade next fall, and the choices you make are no longer those of a foolish boy. Your actions kept you from the field trip today. Do you understand? I'd like to apologize, Mr. Cottingham, Biff began, and then performed the monologue he'd practiced for the past hour. As he spit out insincere words, he set the 4 screws on the edge of the desk, right behind the stack of math books. Long after he was out the door, the top of the desk would either fall right off in front of Mr. Cottingham, or there'd be a sudden clank of screws upon the floor to make him ponder, where did those screws come from? Either discovery would deliver Biff's message. Screw you, Mr. Cottingham. Biff exited the school doors to find his buddies waiting outside, leaning against the practice fence. His cousin Jimmy Nielsen wore a cheap pirate hat over his blonde hair and an eye patch over one of his blue eyes. Beside him, dark-haired Chris Looning held a plastic sword with a fake red jewel in its hilt and had mustard stains down the front of his white t-shirt. "What's up, losers? How was the circus?" "It was fun," Chris answered enthusiastically, only to have his smile stolen as Biff snatched the sword from him. "It was pretty lame," Jimmy said, giving him the right answer. Biff tossed the plastic sword back to Chris. "Asshole. Because of you, I had to spend today in detention with Mr. Cottingham." Chris looked to his toes in shame. Jimmy was his cousin by blood, but Chris was his brother through blood. Before kindergarten, he never knew Chris, but during their elementary years, they discovered they lived on the opposite banks of the Crow Wing River. Even though they were now official blood brothers with scars to prove it, Chris had told on him. As much as Biff wanted to beat the tar out of him, he knew Chris always did the right thing. Biff shrugged it off. "It was stupid. I honestly thought I was going to throw up for most of the morning. If I hadn't been caught, I probably would have upchucked all over the bus." "Did you really eat all of the Rice Krispie bars meant for the entire first grade class?" Chris asked. "The bag lunches were just sitting out on a bench with no note." Jimmy cleared his throat. "Our bus already left. Do you want a ride? My sister is cleaning out her locker." "If the school called home, I'm in no hurry to get back. I'll walk." Chris offered an alternative. "Hey, my folks are gone for the weekend, so I have to stay with my grandparents. You want to come with me?" I guess that's his way of apologizing for being a rat. "The grandpa with the car collection." "Yeah, Grandpa Albert, the rich one." Hell yes, apology accepted. "Sure, why not? I've got time to kill." "Plus, a walk will help you work off those Rice Krispie bars," Jimmy teased. "Get bent," Biff snapped. But then he sighed. "We're still good for fishing tomorrow?" "Yeah, the crappie should be in the channel of Turtle Island." "Can I come?" Chris asked. Chris was a sweet kid, but he was a coddled city kid. Biff hated it when he came fishing with them. "Thought you were staying with your grandparents for the weekend," Biff reminded, getting a bit of cruel revenge. He started walking before calling out, "See you tomorrow, Jimmy." Split Rock Community School was situated on the north side of town. The town was built along the Crow Wing River Valley, which meant everything angled downhill. Along the ridge, however, the newest homes in town were built, and beyond the homes, Albert Fisher's mansion. A former convent had fallen into financial and physical ruin, and the wealthiest man in the community not only purchased the property, but also repurposed the brick into a new home. A brick postgate and wall greeted the boys at the street, and up a long driveway, the brick mansion waited. Biff didn't give the house much thought, for 2 buildings past it was the meticulous garage with the classic cars. On a previous tour, the accumulated wealth took his breath away, and his private studies switched from classic mythology to everything Detroit built. The price for visiting the cars was enduring Grandma Eunice's baking. A shadow caught Biff's eye. In a blink, a dark figure emerged from under the willow. A teenage boy the size of a junior or senior stepped out from the shadows of the tree, took 2 steps toward the long driveway, and disintegrated into thin air. Déjà vu. Chris turned when Biff stopped walking. "What's wrong?" He didn't see it. "Nothing." Biff continued walking, replaying what he'd just seen. A black hat, tattered blue jeans, a long jacket like the old cowboys wore. The teenager even had long hair like a girl. Biff kept his eyes on his feet, feeling the fool. When he looked up, the willow tree was there. It held no secrets or mysteries. The house, a sprawling brick mansion with windows larger than most walls in Biff's house, also seemed normal. Then he saw a white image, a teenage girl in a nightgown. climb out of solid brick and down onto the lawn, walking towards the willow. This time, Biff not only paused, but also stepped back. "Did you see that?" His finger pointed toward the window. "That's just my Grandpa Albert." Almost as sudden as the two apparitions appeared, an old man stood holding a folding chair and a book between a part and the willow curtains. Equally startled, he stared right at Biff. "He likes to relax under the tree in the afternoons. He can be a little strange sometimes, but he's really nice. Let's go say hello." Strange indeed. Like most old men, Albert Fisher had his white hair combed to one side and suspenders keeping his thick cotton pants up to his navel. He was using a metal chair as a crutch to help straighten his back. "Well, what do we have here?" "Hey, Grandpa," Chris said, wrapping his arms around him for a quick hug. Mr. Fisher kept his eyes on Biff while reciprocating the hug. "If you're not the spitting image of your grandfather Bjorn, God rest his soul, how's your brother Paul doing?" "He's stationed in Germany, I guess, if he's not fighting or anything. He just drives his tank around to remind the Krauts who won the war." Mr. Fisher chuckled. "Yes, putting on a good show for a defeated enemy. Yes, I understand completely." He turned towards the house. "Let's get you boys some after-school snacks. I think Eunice made some Rice Krispie bars." Chapter 3. The Quarrymen. Old Copper Road, June 5th, 1961. Biff refused to look at his father as he ate his oatmeal on Monday morning. The kitchen window reflected the darkness of the morning back at him, as if showing an episode of himself, his father, and his mother. His younger sister, Julia, still slept, blissfully ignorant of the tense breakfast. His mother, Edna, stood at the counter with condemnation in her eyes as his father finished shoveling oatmeal into his mouth, gulped down the rest of the hot coffee, and declared, "Time to go." Biff followed his father out into the darkness. The dairy cows were strangely silent. The truck doors and engine seemed twice as loud as normal, and with a flick of his father's wrist, the radio was turned off before it played 3 chords of Hank Williams' "Your Cheatin' Heart." Biff leaned against the glass of the passenger window. He didn't need any light to know where the truck was going. Old Copper Road. They drove past the McPherson farm, the Guerin farm, the Larson farm, past Carousel Amusement Park, through the oaks that reminded Biff of the scene from Wizard of Oz, and up the hill to Jimmy Nielsen's farm. Instead of taking the paved road to the highway, his father stayed on the gravel road. He drove down into the marshy swamp and the old wooden bridge that shook as vehicles passed, and past the Berg farm, the rattiest farm in the county. The shortcut ended in 100 yards of rutted gravel before it came out at Chippewa Beach Resort, a place where fishermen could buy bait in the morning and a steak in the evening. From there, the roads continued to improve until Biff could see the western shore of Lake Manitou out his window. The shortcut ended at the glow of lampposts, not the city lights of St. John, but at the security lights of Haggard Quarry. Under one of the security lights, a closed gate and shack no bigger than an ice house stood in the darkness. His father drove right up to the shack and parked. "Your Uncle Ewan will collect you here. Save some strength for evening milking." All this because of a few Rice Krispie bars. Biff leaned against the shed, waiting for an uncle he barely knew as his father drove off. He'd been told his father's decision had been forming even before Biff had taken a bite of the first bar, but the incident had been the last straw. Soft. That's how his father described him. He all but called me fat. There simply weren't enough chores to do around the farm to serve as punishment, which is when Biff's mother suggested he needed a summer job. Uncle Ewan Haggard was called, and Biff's fate was decided while he was happily eating ice cream at the Fisher Mansion. He was told what was going to happen when he got home that evening. The set of headlights almost blinded him, but what startled him more was that there were a silent sentry inside of the shack, who opened the gate to let the old truck pass. Biff realized how visible he'd been and gave thought to moving, but stayed so that Uncle Ewan would see him upon arrival. In the next hour, a dozen vehicles arrived along with the dawn before his uncle came. "Hop in," a voice finally called to him, and Biff slid into the bench seat of the truck. Uncle Ewan wore an old baseball cap, a short-sleeved plaid shirt, and suspenders to keep his jeans from spilling off his narrow hips and protruding gut. Apparently, guts run in the family. "So I'm tasked with making you a quarryman," Uncle Ewan said as the truck drove past the gate. "I guess." "Well, I've got a job for you. We'll sweat the sass right out of you. Stay in the truck. I've got a few things to take care of in the office." Does he think I'm soft too? The office was a mobile home, parked without any skirting around the bottom, but with a simple wooden deck built in front of the middle door. Uncle Ewan stayed inside for almost half an hour. By the time he came out, the sun was shining over distant Lake Manitou. Uncle Ewan hopped in the driver's seat and spun gravel as he departed. Instead of returning back to the gate, he turned the other direction. And after 100 yards of driving along, the truck turned sharply, and Biff almost catapulted out of his seat. From the highway leading into St. John, he'd always seen the sign for the quarry and pictured a hole in the ground, but his imagination hadn't prepared him for what he saw. A massive pink hole, large enough to fit the entire McPherson farm site, appeared out of his window. It was deep enough to stack 3 barns on top of each other. "Scoot back over. You're going to hit my gear shift." Biff's heart pounded as he slid back over to the window, where he looked over the railless road to the quarry floor below. He'd ridden on all the rides at Carousel Island Amusement Park and had never been so scared. One wrong move by Uncle Ewan meant certain death. The road crisscrossed the northern wall of the pit 4 times before finally opening to the floor, where monsters of mechanism came to life like dinosaurs of old. Cranes, dump trucks, bulldozers, and machines he'd never seen before lined the quarry floor. "Your first job, don't get run over," Uncle Ewan commanded. "These machines are big and loud, so you shouldn't have an excuse, but 5 seconds of daydreaming could cost you your life, understand?" Biff nodded. "Do you see those machines on the west end? That's where the active blasting is happening. Now, you won't be around when we blast, but afterwards, we end up with debris all over the floor of the quarry. You see that building up ahead along the eastern wall?" It was another metal building on wheels. "That's the supply office, and we need to keep the road free of debris so that fuel trucks and the like don't puncture tires on their way in and out of the facility." They drove straight for the supply building, and the center door opened. A man in a red stocking cap stepped out onto the deck. "Your second job? Sweep the floor. It's that simple. Any big rocks you can pick up by hand and toss in the wheelbarrow. If you can't pick them up by hand, we've got a guy that drives a bucket who can push it out of the way. Any smaller rocks, especially those sharp little suckers that get between the groove and a tire tread, you'll need to scoop up with a shovel. Do you see that pile beside the shop? Dump it there." They parked, and the man in the red cap stood patiently for Uncle Ewan. "I'm working on a plan to get you home each afternoon. I'm certainly not going to have you walk home like your pa suggested. Did my sister pack you a hearty lunch?" Biff nodded, grabbing the sack lunch. He opened it, just for confirmation, and saw a Rice Krispie bar on the top. "You gotta be kidding me." Uncle Ewan smirked. "Okay then, let's go meet Red Dobie." Chapter 4. Rock Around the Clock. Haggard Quarry, June 9th, 1961. By the end of the week, blisters had grown hard, just as promised. Biff studied his hands, knowing that he'd soon be able to shovel without gloves. The swarm of mechanical ants were all being parked in the southeastern corner, where the steep wall would protect them from the coming blasts. Although the first summer storm was building in South Dakota, the men of Haggard Quarry prepared for their own storm. The men in charge of blasting had been sizing up a new area all afternoon, and once the quarry was emptied, they'd unleash hell on earth, as Red described it. A cigar signaled the end of the workday. Red Dobie worked most of the day inside the supply building, and when he stepped out on the wooden deck, Biff knew things would end soon. Biff set his hard hat and thick leather gloves on the deck, and then flipped his wheelbarrow upside down to cover them. 1 week down, 11 more to go. His punishment had backfired. By Wednesday, Biff loved working at the quarry, and his shoulders already felt stronger. He also got to talk shit with the men, which was even better. Although Dobie was caustically aloof like an old cowboy in a western, the men who visited him all day were living comic book heroes. Biff's favorite hero descended the quarry wall in an oil truck. Earl Wally Crane had forearms like Popeye and was, in fact, also a former sailor, having served during World War II. His oil truck fueled the quarry operation on a daily basis, and because of his regularity, he became the obvious way for Biff to avoid walking home each day. The brash veteran drove his truck as if it were a motorcycle, with sudden stops and starts and unnecessary growls from the big engine. Biff had known him already as his Boy Scouts leader and the husband of Mrs. Crane, the high school English teacher. But he seemed like a different person the first time he appeared in Haggard Quarry. As soon as the truck parked, Biff walked to the rear to offer a hand with the fueling hose. He got a nod from Wally, who silently went about his job. Even when he finished filling the big fuel drums, Wally remained quiet as he had Dobie sign the paperwork. All right, kid, let's go. Biff climbed up into the passenger seat and left the quarry behind. So how was your day? Wally asked, handing him a stick of gum. Same as yesterday, I suppose. Are you going out fishing tomorrow? Bright and early. I've got to spend a few hours in the blacksmith shop before I can call it a week. How about you? Going fishing? Yeah, we're going fishing for crappies in the shallows of Turtle Island. Thinking they're moving into their spawning beds. Who are you going with? Chris Looning and Jimmy Nielsen. Biff already missed his friends. 6th grade felt a lifetime ago. Marlon Looning is the foreman at the lumber mill, and Jimmy is Ed Nielsen's boy. Do you know everybody? Wally laughed. If you stay in Hiawatha County, one day you'll be the same way. I've spent all but 4 of my 34 years here, so yeah, I know folks. The truck turned north toward St. John so that Wally could take the highway east to Split Rock. In the west, Biff saw the thunderheads building on the horizon. I hope it comes sooner than later. I only get 1 day a week for myself. Unlike the winding gravel roads on the south side of the lake, the north side of the lake was a high bluff that allowed vehicles to travel between the two towns in just a few minutes. Biff's favorite part was the Blue Knife River Valley, where the view from the passenger seat overlooked the concrete railing to the river and delta below. Do you ever fish the Blue Knife? Biff asked. Sure, it's chock full of walleyes, but with so many rocks, you're more likely to get snagged than to get a bite. Above the dam by the reservation, the fishing is a lot better. Biking all the way to the Blue Knife was too ambitious, but in a few years, when he got a car or a truck, Biff planned to make the trip. Your grandfather Bjorn took me fishing just north of the Jesuit school once. It was tribal land, but he was a friend of the Chippewa, so to speak. We caught a bunch of catfish that day. His parents didn't talk much about his grandfather Bjorn. What was my grandfather like? I don't really remember him. I suppose not. You must have been a baby and still living in St. John when he had his heart attack. I really looked up to him. He was a mentor to me, especially after the war. He was a quiet fellow, but he read all the time. It surprised me the tidbits of information that would come out of his mouth. Wally adjusted his rearview mirror. It's nice that your pa took over the dairy farm after his passing. You have any thoughts about being a dairy farmer too? Me? I can't seem to do anything the right way. I was thinking about being a heavy equipment operator or joining the army and driving a tank like Paul. Is he still stationed in Germany? Yeah, but he wrote that they might be redeployed somewhere in the fall. This Vietnam I've been hearing about? Biff shrugged. I think so. Your brother was the first Eagle Scout that Pac 48 ever had. If there's someone destined to be a leader of men, it's your brother. Paul was 10 years older than Biff, meaning Paul was closer to Wally in age. Wally knows my family better than I do. Big shoes to fill, huh? I feel the same way trying to fill the shoes of Bjorn Forsberg. My grandpa was in a war? Oh, well, not World War I if that's what you're thinking. A different kind of war. Wally fiddled with the seam in the steering wheel. Anyway, when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, I enlisted even though I was only a sophomore in high school. I forged the documents, went through basic training, and before anyone found out, I was halfway across the Pacific on the USS South Dakota. Battleship X, they called it back home. Why'd they call it that? The bigwigs kept the identity of the ship hidden in the press in order to keep Japan in the dark. We saw a ton of action, and one day, when you're a little bit older, I'll tell you a few of the stories. Wally might be the coolest cat in Hiawatha County. Did you get your tattoos while in the Navy? Truth be told, I got these after the war was over. I ran wild for the first year or two. It took me a while to readjust to life in Hiawatha County. The oil truck came into Split Rock from the north, passing over the big bridge where the creek met the Crow Wing River, down busy Market Street, and onto Old Copper Road. The town of Split Rock would not have been able to fill a battleship, and its limited industrialization was a creamery and a lumber mill, both of which needed a regular supply of fuel. At the Fisher Lumber Mill, Biff lent a hand once the truck backed up to the fuel tanks. My friend Chris's grandpa owns this place. Wally nodded. I know all about it. Albert Fisher's a good friend of mine, and so is Marlon Looning. But there was a time when I thought those two were going to tear this community apart. I suppose driving around lets you hear everybody's gossip. Why? Wally looked around and whispered, navigating small towns can be tricky. Sometimes you need context. Marlon wasn't much older than you when he took a fancy to Albert Fisher's only child. So when she got pregnant, underage and out of wedlock, you can imagine the scandal it created. Took everything in my power to keep them civil. That's when Albert moved up to the big house on the hill and left his daughter and her new husband the old mansion. I'm telling you this so you don't put your foot in your mouth when you're around that family. The town needs those two families. The social currency didn't interest Biff, which Wally seemed to notice as they drove from the lumber mill to the creamery. The topic quickly changed as they got out of the truck to fill the fuel oil tank near the rear of the creamery. They say the ghost of the Van Slyke boy haunts this place, Wally offered, raising an eyebrow as they held the fuel line in place. He died in an explosion, and during big storms or rainy days, they say he wanders these woods looking for his brother. Biff turned away, looking up the hill toward the farmstead and the growing clouds in the western sky. Baloney! There's no such thing as ghosts. You're just trying to scare me. You've never seen a ghost? Is that what I saw a few days ago with Chris? A ghost? No, have you? Wally hesitated, but Biff suspected it was all for play. Nah, but my father swore he'd seen ghosts and more. If the storm wakes you up tonight, keep your eye on the woods and tell me if you see anything. Biff shook his head. Sure, Wally, sure. The long work week finally ended when the oil truck pulled into the lot of the Forsberg farm, where his sister Julia bounced out the front door to greet him. His father, wiping grease from his forearms, stood at the garage. He gave a nod of acknowledgement to Wally before turning away. "Thanks, Wally. I'll see you on Monday. Hope you find the crappies." "Yeah, me too." Instead of counting sheep that night, Biff imagined reeling in crappie after crappie. It wasn't the storm that woke him from his dream. It was Julia. The flicker of lightning illuminated his bedroom. With a blanket wrapped around her, she looked like a cartoon ghost. Biff brushed her hand away from his shoulder. "What do you want?" "I'm scared. Go bother Mom and Dad." Julia shook her head. "They won't believe me." "Again?" "Believe you about what?" She hesitated. "I had another dream just now." "About Two-Face?" Biff asked in reference to another nightmare during the storm. Julia nodded. "When I woke up, I could still hear her." Two-Face, the nightmare about a girl who was half alive and half dead. "It's just the storm," Biff said, glancing at the open window. The wind, rain, and lightning still raged in the darkness. Biff had two choices, and he damn sure wasn't about to stand at the window like a fool looking for ghosts in the woods. So he patted the bed and slid over to make room for his sister. He put an arm over her little body and felt her shaking slowly begin to cease. He watched the window for a few more minutes before closing his eyes and tried to imagine slip bobbers and knots instead of things that go bump in the night. Chapter 5. Bait for Predators. Old Copper Road, June 9th, 1961. Jimmy Nielsen, filled with dread, stood at his bedroom window. A thick blanket of fog had been left by the big storm, hiding Lake Manitou from sight. Even the barn was almost swallowed by the heavy mist, with the light from the big electric pole diffused by the moisture in the air. They won't come now, not if it's this foggy. Jimmy looked at his clock. The sun wouldn't rise until 5:30, and even then it'd take hours to burn off such a heavy fog bank. Something moved in the darkness, and Jimmy's heart stopped for just a moment until he realized it was his father going to do chores. He grabbed a fresh t-shirt and slipped into the same jeans he wore yesterday and his leather work boots. He didn't bother tying the laces, and as soon as he left his room, he made no effort to soften his step as he passed by his older sister's bedrooms. In the kitchen, his mother was preparing breakfast. To him, she was an old lady, at least in her 40s. But when she didn't keep her hair in a bun, she looked years younger. The daughter of Bjorn Forsberg and Emily McPherson, his mother Bonnie, had strawberry blonde hair, now lightened by age. Finally turning her attention away from the stove and to the table, she asked, "Why are you up so early?" "I'm meeting Chris and Biff to go fishing." "Do you want me to pack a lunch?" "Could you?" Jimmy looked out the kitchen window at the wall of fog. "They won't come until the fog lifts, and that might be noon." While Jimmy ate his bacon and eggs, his mother quickly switched from breakfast preparation to the construction of sandwiches, including an extra set for Chris and his cousin Biff. With the lunches bagged, Jimmy shoveled in the last bit of food, stood, and kissed his mother on the cheek. "I'm going to go see if Pa needs help with the chores." "Don't get lost in that fog," she teased as he walked out the door. Is she serious? Unlike his cousin's dairy farm, the Nielsen farm had a little bit of everything, from chickens, sheep, pigs, cattle, and a few horses in the barn on their 160 acres. He found his father leaning against a wooden pen with a solitary calf inside the skirt of the barn. "I think this one might have pink eye. We'll keep an eye on him for a couple days. You got any plans?" "I'm going fishing with the boys, remember?" "Ah, crappies in the shallows. You're going down to Turtle Island?" Jimmy nodded. Ed Nielsen, the grandson of settlers Martin Nielsen and Dolly Larson, had short blonde hair that he covered with a blue and white DeKalb Seeds cap. He wore denim overalls with a flannel shirt and all-season, all-terrain rubber boots that made his stride sound like a giant instead of the small-framed man he was. Despite his size, Jimmy's father was a giant to all the local farmers, who held him in high esteem. Jimmy also held him in high esteem and almost matched his father in size already. Then, the price to go fishing is that your friends help haul the rowboat down to the shore for the summer. His father knew all the rock formations hidden by the lake and could drop the anchor right on top of walleyes. I just hope they show up. At least it's not windy. The fish won't know it's foggy. I'm sure you'll do fine. Jimmy Nielsen stood on the hill overlooking Lake Manitou. Even though the fog had not lifted, he knew where he stood from the rocks collected in the corners of each field. Unlike the other farms in Hiawatha County, the Nielsen farm bordered almost a mile of lakeshore, giving it a beautiful view but terrible land for crops. The land closest to the lake was the worst, fit only for grazing. Jimmy's feet followed the sloping hill, but he made sure not to stray too far west where GB Hollow lurked. The swampy land between the Nielsen and Berg farms was overgrown with brush. And after reading Hawthorne's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, terrible dreams of headless ghosts haunted his nightmares. Entering GB Hollow in the fog terrified him, so he purposely walked a little longer route just to avoid an imagined fate. The rising sun made the fog even denser, with only a few yards of visible ground at any time. Nevertheless, Jimmy found the rocky shore of Lake Manitou and the isthmus pointing toward the unseen Turtle Island. Years earlier, his great-granddad Martin had cleared the boulders away from the shore near the neck, leaving 20 yards of beach. There, Jimmy spotted the posts and chains for the bait traps. He set down his fishing pole, tackle box, and bucket of snacks, but proceeded no further. Entering Lake Manitou alone will get you killed. His great-granddad had told him that, and he'd never forgotten the sinister warning. So he waited. His eyes were drawn to an oddity near the shoreline. At first, he thought it might just be a fragment of a broken muskrat nest, but the intricacy of the twisted twigs drew him closer. A few feet from the object, Jimmy stopped, straightened his back, and then looked all around. It was a tiny man. Not a real man, of course, but something fashioned to look like a man. The legs, arms, and head were made of wild sage, bent and twisted and tied together. He'd heard plenty of stories about the lake being haunted, and seeing the relic from the past brought goosebumps to his forearms. After a 30-minute wait, the sound of bicycles broke the silence, followed by the sound of bickering. Jimmy stood and whistled. The bicycles squeaked to a halt. "Down here, guys!" Jimmy began stripping off his socks and shoes, and by the time Biff and Chris dropped their bikes, he was ready for the cold trek into the water. "How's life at the quarry?" As Biff complained, Jimmy walked out into the knee-deep water, found the chain, pulled up the wire basket. Inside, dozens of trapped minnows shimmered. He scooped up a few handfuls to place in the bucket. Each minnow would transform into a pancake-sized crappie, if lucky. With bait ready and his shoes back on, he listened to Biff continue to complain as they walked the rest of the way up to the Narrows. Even though there was no sign of the fog yet, the fog bank had grown whiter, brighter. Across the channel, the green hump of Turtle Island appeared. "Hey, Jimmy, can you check my knot?" Chris asked. With a tug, the line slipped free. "How many times have I shown you this?" Jimmy chastised as he began retying the knot. Chris was good with the books, but anything out of the classroom took him 3 times as long to learn. With the crappies sitting on spawning beds, an accurate cast meant a certain bite, and by the time the fog evaporated, they'd eaten the food and replaced it with fresh fish. At this rate, they won't even last until lunch, Jimmy realized. He just wanted company, so he offered a suggestion. Hey, you know what we should do this afternoon? We should work on the hunting cabin out on Cedar Point. Biff released a puff of steam. And spend all day hauling lumber through the woods? I've got better things to do. Oh, I forgot. You're a working man now. If anything, we should be working on my deer stand. Deer don't even go up the hill to Bleeding Rock. It's haunted, Jimmy shot back. It was worth a shot, Jimmy thought when Biff didn't respond. The fishing suddenly went cold, leaving their unfinished conversation lingering. Chris broke the silence. Do you guys believe in, ghosts and such? Jimmy glanced west to GB Hollow. Hell yes. While his father insisted ravens could mimic human voices, he'd heard too many strange things coming from the wooded ravine. Cedar Point, on the far eastern side of his property, was covered with tall pines and a golden carpet of pine needles. GB Hollow was filled with shadows and tangled branches. I think it's all bullshit, Biff weighed in. I think the adults are just trying to scare us to keep us under their thumbs. Do you see any of the high school kids afraid of ghosts? Don't be a sucker, Chris. Chris deflated a bit. Have you seen ghosts, Chris? Jimmy asked. Probably not. Most likely it's just my mind imagining things in the fog, right? That's probably when people first invented the idea of a ghost, during a foggy morning like this. Biff chuckled. Is that why you raced through the woods on Old Copper Road? Chris ignored him and turned to Jimmy. There's got to be a reason the Indians named this place Lake Manitou. Do you believe in the Manitou? My granddad Martin used to tell me stories of the horned serpent that lived in the depths of Lake Manitou, but it sounded a lot like the story of the Loch Ness Monster. My grandpa Bjorn used to tell me the stories about the Tokpai, the little monsters who live in the holes along the lakeshore, but my dad said he made it all up to frighten me. If there was a monster living under Lake Manitou, then how can Haggard Quarry be deeper than Lake Manitou, huh? My dad used to tell me all the stories were just exaggerations, Chris continued, but I still have bad dreams about it, especially when it storms. Do you guys ever have bad dreams like that? Jimmy looked down, wishing the conversation would end. Did I tell you I got a new Playboy with Stella Stevens in it? Biff didn't respond and instead stepped over and thumped Chris with a punch to the shoulder. Ouch, what was that for? Even if it was real, a spirit can't muster that much force. Without arms or legs, what do you have to worry about? Jimmy rolled his eyes and gestured to Cedar Point. Biff took the hint. We should go clean these fish, and then we can help with the hunting shack for a while. Do you still have the issue with Marilyn Monroe? Yeah, Jimmy answered, sensing another kind of fish on the line. I think we've caught enough crappies. We should go hang out at your cabin. Good idea. Once again, the bait works. This is the end of part 1 of The Wintermaker.